That. All right. Well, good evening and welcome to our Fall into Obob 2024 event series. I'm Julie, the events manager at Roundabout Books in Bend, Oregon. Just a reminder, as you heard, this event is being recorded. So if you don't want to be on video, you can turn that off, but we will be able to hear you later during the Q&A section if you want to ask a question. Comments and questions are welcome in the chat window throughout the event. We just ask that you stay muted while our author is speaking. We've heard from a couple people that they came to our Obob events before. You can also put in the chat if this is your first time participating in Obob at all. We love to have new people with us. We are so excited tonight to talk to Jessica Khoury about the Mystwick School of Musicraft. So here's a little bit about the book if you haven't read it yet. It says humor and heart shine in this middle grade fantasy about a girl who attends a boarding school to learn how to use music to create magic. Perfect for fans of Nevermoor and the School for Good and Evil series. Jessica is joining us tonight from all the way in South Carolina. She's the author of multiple books for teens and young readers. In addition to writing, she is an artistic map maker and spends far too much time scribbling tiny mountains and trees for fictional worlds. Her spare hours are spent video gaming, painting, or cooking badly. So please, everyone, let's welcome Jessica to talk about her book.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me all right? Great. I'm so excited to be here with you guys. As you heard from Julie, I am all the way in South Carolina, so it's 9 o'clock here where I am. But that's okay because I do my best work at night. That's when my imagination kind of wakes up, is when the sun goes down. So I'm really excited that I get to spend this evening with you. I'm so happy that you are reading the Mystwick School of Musicraft for your Battle of the Books this year. I can't wait to talk to you more about the book and how I came up with the idea for it and how it was written, and also answer any questions that you might have. So thank you for being here. So I'm Jess, and I was originally born and grew up in the state of Georgia. Now I'm in South Carolina, and I live like in the upper part of South Carolina where the mountains are, and I love to hike and go see waterfalls and things like that. I also really love Oregon. I actually have my uncle who lives in Mount Hood. So I've been out there quite a few times, and I think my opinion, is one of the most beautiful states in the country. So you guys are very lucky to live there. And I hope I get to visit again very soon. So I've wanted to be an author since I was 4 years old. So when I was 4, I started reading books for the first time. And in fact, the very first book that I ever read, like by myself, was this one. It's a picture book called Danny and the Dinosaur by author and illustrator Sid Hoff. And when I was a kid, I was completely obsessed with dinosaurs. So this book was perfect for me. And it's a book about a boy, Danny, there he is, who goes to a museum, and this museum exhibit of a dinosaur comes to life, and they go off and have adventures together and have a really, really great time. But the very last page of the story shows Danny walking home, sad because the dinosaur has to go back to the museum, back to being a lifeless exhibit, and Danny's heartbroken, and he goes home, and that's the end of the story. Interestingly, they updated this story after I was a kid, after I read it, and gave it a happy ending. So if you go buy the book now, it has a different ending. But when I was a kid, it had this sad ending. And so being 4 years old, I didn't like that. I thought this book should have a happy ending. So I went to preschool the next day, and I got a few pages out of my preschool notebook, and I decided to write a sequel to Danny and the Dinosaur. And I called it Danny and the Building Blocks. And I drew the pictures for it. I wrote all the words, and every single word was spelled wrong. But I was really proud of it, and I stapled it together, and I took it to preschool and gave it to my teacher, and she called all my friends to come sit on the story time circle, and she read them my book. And that was the moment I knew I wanted to be an author and a writer and an illustrator when I grew up. So all through school, elementary school, middle school, high school, and even college, I was constantly reading books and writing stories and drawing pictures and hoping and dreaming of the day I might get to be a real author too, like Sid Hoff. And some of you may have heard this term before called fan fiction. So fan fiction is what it's called when a writer writes a story based on another author's characters. So really, I started my journey as a writer by writing fan fiction of Danny and the Dinosaur. And a lot of authors actually get their start that way. So when I graduated from college in 2010, I had a degree in English literature. So there was lots of reading and writing involved. I loved it. And the summer after that, I decided I really wanted to try to make my dream that I'd had all these years. For 20 years, I've been dreaming of being an author. I was like, it's finally time to try. And so I went out with my first book that I wrote while I was in college, and I spent 4 years writing this book. And I loved it. And I poured everything that I had into it. And I thought, this is the best thing I will ever create. If this book doesn't get published, nothing I ever write could possibly work. Guess what? It did not get published. In fact, every agent and editor that I took it to said, no, thank you, not interested, which was pretty heartbreaking for me because, like I said, I'd spent 20 years working on this dream and hoping and thinking, oh, if I put everything I have into this story, surely my dream will come true. And it did not. And so I remember that summer, after getting like another rejection in the mail for my story, I went for a walk and I was really feeling pretty bad for myself. And I was kind of having a little bit of a pity party. And then I had this picture come into my mind of a girl trapped by glass walls and surrounded by jungle. And I didn't know anything else, but I was so intrigued and interested and curious about this girl that I ran home and I just started writing. And a month later, I finished the first draft of Origin, which was my very first book to be published. And it came out in 2012. So that was 12 years ago. Some of you maybe weren't even born yet. But that was my first book to come out. And now I'm on book 17, I think. So about five books later, is when I wrote Mystwick. And Mystwick is a very, very special book. One of the main questions that people ask me as an author, and at every school I go to, every group of kids I talk to, this is the question they ask. Where do you get your ideas for stories? And the answer is kind of hard because for every book, it's different. Stories come from any place, any time. And the thing about a writer or any kind of storyteller is we're always kind of ready for those ideas. So when an idea comes, we write it down, we keep it in our mind, and we keep thinking about it like, oh, what happens with this idea if I take it in this direction? What if I take it in this direction? Who is this? Who could be like the star of this story? And so whenever an idea comes, I write it down and I hold on to it. And then I just kind of wait to see what other inspiration will come. So for Mystwick, I know exactly when this story started. And it happened when I was sitting in the very front row of an orchestra or concert hall in my town where I live now of Greenville, South Carolina. And I was there to see a Broadway show that was touring through our area. And because I was sitting in the very front row, I had a great view of the orchestra pit, which is the kind of place that's sunken down under the stage where all of the musicians play the music that the actors sing with while they're in the play. And so before the show started, the orchestra was in the pit and they were warming up for the production. And I was watching the conductor, who is the person that leads the orchestra, and he had his baton and he's waving his baton around, and all of the musicians were playing their instruments, and I had all this emotion and I was watching them. I was like, oh my goodness, this feels like magic. And that's when I had the idea, what if there was a world where music was magic and every song in our world, in that world, was a spell of some kind. And that was the day I got the idea for the Mystwick School of Musicraft. But I still didn't have any other parts of the story. I didn't know who the main character was, or where it was set, or even what year it was set in. In fact, for several years, I thought maybe the main character would be like 17 and she might live in the 1800s in England, and maybe she would like fall in love or something and it would be really romantic. But every time that I sat down to like write that story, I couldn't make it work. I couldn't have any ideas for like scenes or characters. Nothing was really working. And I was like, this isn't right. I don't know. I don't know enough about this character yet. So I put that story aside. I went and wrote some other books. And then a couple years later, it occurred to me kind of out of nowhere. I was like, oh, I remember that idea I had about that world where music creates magic. I still really, really love that. And I want to write it, but I just couldn't get it to work. And I thought, what if the main character isn't 17, but she's 12? And what if she doesn't live in the 1800s, but she lives now in our time? And that is when the story clicked. And because I finally knew who it was about, of course, that would be Amelia Jones, the main character. I sat down and I started writing. And where it had taken me years to try to make the story work before, and it didn't work, this time I sat down, I started writing, and I could finish the first draft in just 2 weeks, which is crazy fast. It wasn't a very good draft. I had to go back and do a lot of editing, of course, to make the story better and longer and more interesting. But those first 2 weeks, I finished the first draft, and that's when I knew this was something special. This was going to be a story that could have lots of sequels. It could have a whole world built around it. And I was absolutely in love with the characters. And that is how the story began. And the setting was the next thing. After I knew who the main character was, I was like, where's the story going to be set? And the world of Mystwick, this school in the Rocky Mountains, was actually based on a lodge that I would go stay at once or twice a year with a bunch of other authors. And we would go there and have writing retreats. We would sit around a big like conference table for hours every day, and we would just work on our stories. And since I was going there for a writing retreat, I thought, well, maybe this could be the setting. And so that's why I decided to have this school that looks like kind of like a ski lodge up in the mountains. And that's where Amelia would go to school and learn how to use her flute to play spells that would create magic. And she would make friends there and she would make enemies there, and all kinds of magical, crazy nonsense would happen to her. And she would have to figure out how to use her magic to save the day. And that is where the story really came together, and I could see it all in my head and finally get it out on paper. So for those of you who have the book, I'm guessing most of you are probably reading it. There is also an audiobook version. So the audiobook version actually came out first. And it's very, very cool because in this story, there's lots of music that the characters play. They call them spells, like Beethoven spells and Mozart spells. And if you listen to the audiobook, you can hear all of the music being played by the New Jersey Youth Symphony Orchestra. So real kids who are playing the parts of the characters in the book. And that's very, very cool. I also have a playlist on Spotify that have all the music in the story, so you could just listen to it while you're reading, and that you can hear the spells Amelia and her friends are playing in the book. Now, of course, it does have a couple sequels. The Midnight Orchestra, which is the second book, that came out a couple years later. The Dark Refrain came out this year in audiobook. It should come out next year in print. And then I actually yesterday just turned in the fourth book of the series, which I can't even tell you the title yet because it's still a secret. But there will be a fourth book coming as well. So I hope you guys enjoy reading Mystwick. I hope that if you read it, you'll be able to hear all of the music going on in your head, or find the music to listen to on the internet or something like that as you read the story. And another question people ask me a lot, because it is a story a lot about music and music school, people ask me if I play an instrument. So yes, when I was a kid, I took piano lessons for 10 years. I took a little bit of violin lessons as well. But when I turned 16, I started getting really, really bad wrist pain. And I started developing something called carpal tunnel syndrome, where your wrists are just kind of falling apart. because as a teenager, I would spend maybe like 3 or 4 hours a day writing on my computer. And I would spend another hour or 2 hours playing piano. And my doctor said, Jess, you're doing too much with your hands. You're going to have to choose either music or writing. And I chose writing. And I'm really glad I did because I wasn't very good at piano, to be honest. I was okay, but I wasn't like, I would never have gotten into the Mystwick School of Musicraft. I would have auditioned and they would have been like, no, thank you. But I really loved playing piano and I got to put all of that I learned and all of the passion that I had for music into this book. So it kind of came back full circle in the end anyway. So yeah, that is how the story came together, where the idea came from, a little bit of what that process looked like. With most of my books, I get the idea. I have to wait a while to see if the idea stays interesting. Sometimes I have to change who the main character is, or when it's set, or even change like the ages of the characters and therefore the genre of the book before it works. But once I find like what the story really is and what the heart of the story is, that's when the magic really starts to happen. And that's always my favorite part of the writing process is when everything just clicks and you know, oh, there's something here. So I would love to take some time to answer any questions that you guys have. And I see a lot of you are mentioning the instruments that you play, which is fantastic. We've got violin, piano, guitar, a lot of future Mystwick students here I can see. That's awesome. Um, if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box and I will answer them. As they pop up, I'll try to keep tabs on that. Violin. When I was in second grade, I played violin for like 1 year, and it's still my favorite instrument. That and the cello. But I was in second grade and holding the violin like for hours to practice, like really, really hurt my arms. And so I quit. And I really wish I hadn't quit, because I love the violin. And I hope one day to pick it up again and like relearn how to play it because I think it's such a beautiful instrument. But I was probably just too young at the time to really appreciate it the way I should have. Let's see, who is my favorite character in Mystwick other than Amelia? So let's see. I always feel like I'm most similar to Amelia in the story, but my favorite character would be her best friend, Jai Kapoor, who is her age and he plays violin, and he's one of the first Mystwick students that she meets. And I love Jai because he is a very bubbly, friendly person and immediately becomes Amelia's friend. And even though he kind of is a little bit melodramatic. He is very funny and very loyal and always backs Amelia up no matter what. And I really love writing him. He's also kind of the comedic relief. So he's the one that like when things are getting too serious, he comes in and says something that lightens the mood and makes Amelia laugh and feel better. And I think that is sometimes the best kind of friend to have. And so I really liked writing Jai. But my other favorite character in the story is a teacher, one of Amelia's teachers. In Mystwick, all the teachers are called maestros. And my favorite maestro is Mr. Pinwhistle, who's her homeroom teacher. And he is very, very grumpy and grouchy at first. But he's also a character that has many layers and secrets as well. So I really enjoyed writing him into the story, especially in the sequels. He kind of develops a lot and has a really fun storyline. Good question. All right. What is the main character's background? So Amelia, the main character, and the whole series is told from her perspective, so first person perspective. She grows up with is raised by her grandmother because her mother died when she was very young and her father left and she doesn't know where he is or why he left her. She hasn't seen him since she was 4 years old. So she was raised by her grandmother and she grew up in a very small town. And just like I did, I grew up in a very small town. And just like me, Amelia loves to play in the woods. She has a tree house she hangs out in, but she also kind of has like a lonely childhood because all she does is play the flute. And she loves music and she dedicates herself so much to music that she kind of doesn't have time for friends until she goes to Mystwick, and then she starts to learn how important it is to make time for other people and to make time for friendship, as well as developing her music and becoming a better musician. So that's a little bit about her background. If you read the books, you will find a lot more about Amelia's background that she doesn't even know yet. And I'm not going to tell you because they're big, big, big. But there's a lot about her history and her past that come back in book 1, book 2, book 3, and book 4. She has lots to learn about where she came from and who her family is. All right, I have a question. Does Amelia look like me because we both have red hair and I have green eyes? Amelia has, I think, blue eyes. So Amelia is actually based on my little sister. So I have a sister who is 15 years younger than me. And when I was writing Mystwick, my sister was 11 or 12, the same age as Amelia. And that's why when you read the book, you'll see that it's actually dedicated to my sister Madeline, because she was the first person I showed this book to. And I would write a couple chapters at a time, and I would give them to her and say, what do you think? Give me your feedback, because you're like exactly the age of what a reader would be reading this book. And she loved it so much, and she drew pictures of Amelia for me, and she made me like want to keep writing because of her excitement. And so I decided to kind of base Amelia on her, and she has really, really much curlier red hair than I do. And so even though Amelia does look like me because I also have red hair, she's technically based on my little sister, to whom the book is dedicated. Great question. Why did you put the other Amelia Jones in? So if you've read the first couple chapters in Mystwick, so this isn't really a spoiler because it happens early on, you'll find out that Amelia gets into Mystwick by accident. So to get into this school, which is like the hardest music school to get into in the whole country, you have to go through some really tough auditions. Amelia goes to her audition and it goes terribly wrong. It is the worst audition in the history of auditions. She knows right away. She's like, there's no way I'm getting into this school. I totally blew it. But then lo and behold, she gets an acceptance letter to Mystwick. She's like, okay, maybe I didn't do as bad as I thought. So she goes to the school, she gets there and finds out she got the wrong acceptance letter. It was supposed to go to a different Amelia, who was a very famous pianist or piano player, like a prodigy who's really super famous all around the world. And she tragically perished in a boating accident. And so her acceptance letter got rerouted, magically rerouted to our Amelia, and she ends up at this school. Oh, isn't supposed to be there, but the teachers kind of feel bad for her, and they're like, okay, we'll give you a couple months to prove that you're good enough to stay here. And at the end of those 2 months, we'll give you a test, and then we'll, decide whether to let you stay or not. And so that's where the other Amelia Jones came in. And I won't say more than that because that would be spoilers as well. If you've read the second book, you know. But yes, that is why there is a second Amelia Jones mentioned early on in the story. It's like a mistaken identity is how Amelia gets into this school. Whether or not she proves she's good enough to stay there, I can't tell you. You'll have to read it to find out.
So we do have a hand raised for someone to ask
Okay.
a question. So Catherine, if you want to unmute, you can ask your question.
How long did it take you to make that book?
Good question. So I wrote the first draft in 2 weeks. But that doesn't really count for like the whole book because, like I said, I had to do a lot of editing. Every writer, when they're working on a book, works on a first draft, and then we have a second draft, and then a third draft, and then a fourth draft. And so probably altogether, maybe 6 to 9 months of sending the book to my agent or my editor who would read it, and then she'll send me back a letter that says like, I think you need to change this section a little bit. I think you need to change this part a little bit. Maybe change a few things about the beginning. So then I'll go back up to the book and I'll take it apart and I'll work on it some more. And then I'll send it back and then she'll make smaller notes and then she'll send it back to me and it goes back and forth until everybody's happy and the book feels like it's finished. So altogether 6 to 9 months, I would say, that we worked on it before it was like the final book that you hold in your hands. Great question.
Nice. So Charlotte, I see you have your hand raised and it sounds like maybe you want to clarify one of your questions. So go ahead and unmute and you can ask.
Yeah, I didn't mean why you put the other Amelia Jones in like that. I was wondering why you decided to like have her as like what the real Amelia as like thinking she was a ghost and things.
Okay, so why Amelia thinks she's a ghost?
Yeah, like why did you put the ghosts in it?
Oh, well, Amelia gets to the school, and if you haven't read this far yet, for
No,
everyone
I've read the whole
else,
book.
you read the whole book. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we'll talk about it, but like also try not to spoil it for in case anyone else hasn't finished it. So if you haven't finished it, it's not really a spoiler to know like Amelia meets a ghost at the school who's trying to get her expelled. She thinks it's the ghost of the other Amelia Jones whose place she took at the school. And so she thinks that this girl has come back as a ghost to try to haunt her and get her expelled from the school as like revenge. And how can I say this without giving away spoilers? Let me think. Well, I knew I wanted I wanted something or someone to be in the school, like making it really hard for Amelia to stay there because she's trying so hard to prove like, I am a good enough musician to be at this school. Please don't send me home, even though I'm not really supposed to be here. But when you have a character in a story, stories only become interesting because everything is going wrong for them, at least for most of the book. If everything was going right for them, it would be boring and there wouldn't really be a story. So every character needs like problems to overcome. So Amelia has this problem of having to prove she's good enough at the school, but like, how can we make even more problems for her? Well, here's a ghost that's trying to get her expelled. And maybe it's the ghost of the girl who died and Amelia got in her place at the school. But I won't say more than that because I don't want to spoil it for anybody else. But does that help answer your question? Okay. Thank you for clarifying.
So let's do another question from the chat and then we have another hand raised. But Jocelyn asked, how did you think of what songs went to which spells?
Okay, very good question. So one big thing when I'm writing the story and like, for example, there's a scene where Amelia is charming a chicken. So there's a chicken that's stuck under a chicken coop and the chicken's owner asks Amelia to help with magic. So she comes and plays her flute and she's like, I need a flute that's gonna like charm the chicken so that they'll come out and like do what I want them to do. And so for that spell, I was like, well, what is a spell that kind of has that theme of like something moving from one place to another place and like the ants go marching. The lyrics of that song are like they're marching from one place to another. So maybe that could be the spell. And so for a lot of the music that Amelia plays, I think about like what was the intention of the song in our world? Like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. In our world, we're singing about, okay, twinkle, twinkle, little star. It's like glowing, it's a light. So maybe in Amelia's world, that's a spell to produce a small point of light. So like when they're outside and it's dark, they play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and they have like a glowing ball of light that follows them around to illuminate their surroundings. For bigger pieces of magic, like when the orchestra plays like a big spell to produce fireworks or something like that, I go into like big classical symphonies and concertos, and I listened to so many, like dozens and dozens of classical music. I think of like the music I love to play when I play piano, or I would just like listen to music constantly. Every morning, I would drive my daughter to preschool and I would listen to NPR. And at the time that I was driving her to preschool and back, they would be playing like classical music and talking about composers and musicians. And so I got a lot of inspiration from that as well. And often I would try to pick music that matched like the mood of the scene. So if it's like a very dangerous scene where the character's like fighting something, then I'll try to go for a piece of music that feels like it's for battle music or something like that. Or if it's a spell where they're like falling asleep, you want something peaceful and soft, like a lullaby, especially because I was imagining, what if it's an audiobook and you're hearing the music, you want the music to like match how the scene feels. The same way you would like in a movie, like the music that plays, the score that plays behind the scene, you want it to match the tone and the mood of the scene. So I had all kinds of things to think about when I was picking out which songs the characters would play. In their world, they're all called spells. They don't actually ever use the word song. Earlier today, my daughter, who's in 3rd grade, was practicing piano, and I had just finished working on the 4th Mystwick book. And so I told her to sit down. I said, sit down and practice your spell. And she looked at me, she's like, what? I was like, oh, wait, this is the Mystwick. Your song, practice this song. And she thought that was pretty hilarious. So now she insisted that I call them spells for the rest of her practicing. But yeah, so that's how I came up with all the spells. Thinking about what does that song represent in our world? What does it sound like? What kind of mood or feelings do you get when you're listening to it? And then the third thing, which is kind of funny, is that I had to find all music that was in the public domain, which means music that was written like far enough in the past or in such a way that anybody could use that song without violating an artist's or musician's copyrights, because we were putting a lot of this music into the audiobook, and it would be kind of hard to, like, if I put in like Taylor Swift songs, for example, I would probably get sued by Taylor Swift if I didn't pay thousands and thousands of dollars to license her music. And so to avoid not getting sued by Taylor Swift or any other musician, I went for music in the public domain. And anything in the public domain, it can be art, it can be books, it can be music, means anybody anywhere can use that in any way they want without any legal problems coming up for them. So that was also something that I thought about, more of a business legal thing I thought about when writing the book.
Yeah. So Sarah has had their hand raised for a little bit. So Sarah, if you want to unmute and ask your question.
My question is, like, how did you choose your like instruments, and is there any background knowledge on Amelia's dad?
Great questions. So to the first question, choosing the instruments. Well, one really important thing when I was choosing instruments for my main characters in my story, and this might sound a little silly, but it was very practical. They had to play instruments that were very portable, meaning they were small enough the characters could like run around with them. So for example, it would be really hard if Amelia played piano, because she would always have to be sitting at a piano whenever she used her magic. She couldn't like be running through the woods, running away from a ghost, playing the piano. That would be a little bit awkward. But a flute is something small enough that she can carry with her on her adventures. Jai plays a violin, and their other friend Darby plays an oboe, which are smaller instruments that you're able to travel around with. And they don't have to always be like sitting at a giant cello or a piano or at a drum set, even though those instruments do come into the story quite a bit. For other characters, I needed my like main characters to be able to move around a lot. And then I also wanted to choose instruments that I really liked. The main reason I gave Amelia a flute is because I was inspired by the magic flute, which is like a symphony or set of songs composed by Mozart. And it's a very famous opera. And I thought the magic flute, Amelia's magical, she plays the flute. I thought that was cool. Jai got a violin because that's one of my favorite instruments. And Darby got an oboe because I didn't know anything about the oboe, and I thought it would be fun to learn about it. So yeah, those are some of the thoughts that I had when choosing the instruments. As for Amelia's dad, like I said earlier, her dad vanished when she was 4 after her mother died in a tragic accident. And Amelia hasn't heard from him since. Yes, you will find out a lot about Amelia's dad, but only if you read books 2, 3, and 4. If you read just book 1, you're not going to find much out. Got to continue the series because there's a lot more for Amelia to learn there. I'm not going to tell you because that would be spoilers.
Right. We've got one more hand raised, and then we'll go back to the chat. So I see your it says iPhone. So if you want to ask your question. Here, I can unmute you too. One sec. Oh, I don't have my mouse.
If you could be one of the characters from the book for a day, who would you be?
That's a really good question. If I could be one of them for a day, who would I want to be? I don't know if I'd want to be one of the kids because they have like a really high stress school environment. Like Mystwick is a really hard school like to go to. They have to practice all the time and take lots of tests and be like really, really good at everything they do. So I feel like I would get pretty stressed out from that. But I think it'd be really fun to be the head maestro, which is the head mistress of the school or like the principal of Mystwick. Her name is Mrs. LaRoe, and she's very cool. And I think it would be fun to be her for a day because she has a pet music cat. So in Amelia's world, a music cat is a cat that can, when it purrs, it creates magic. And Wink the music cat is one of my favorite characters and would be a pretty awesome pet to have. Plus, I would like to be in charge of the whole school for a day, and then maybe I could help Amelia and her friends out because they're always so stressed out and always having problems. And I could come in and fix all their problems for them because they really need some help sometimes. Good question.
So there's a couple questions in the chat. Jenna asked and did want to clarify that we mean our Amelia. Meet and befriend an animal.
Well, I did mention Wink, so that is one animal that she meets. There's another type of animal she meets in the first book called the hum frogs, which are frogs that repeat any melody that they hear. And if you get to that point in the story, you'll see how that quickly goes very, very, very wrong for Amelia. And they don't really become her friend, I would say. I think the hum frogs, after they meet Amelia, want nothing more to do with her after that. Other animals. There are other animals that come in like the later books in the series here and there. In the book 1, there's a parrot. Parrots are also magical in Amelia's world. So there's a parrot named Captain who helps kind of co-pilot the Zeppelin that brings the kids to and from school. And he's pretty cool.
So we've
Great
got
question.
another question that's a little bit about the writing process, but wondering if you've ever used like voice to text to help you write your books.
Voice to text. Yeah, I do use that occasionally. I like it because when I'm having like a conversation between the characters, I like to kind of talk it out loud. And sometimes I'll do that like if I'm driving in the car, because it's kind of hard to like write and drive at the same time. It's probably like illegal also. So it's easier just to turn on like my notes app on my phone and I'll just dictate like a scene or just ideas for the story. And then I'll go home and write them. I don't do a ton of voice to text just because I find that it spells so many words wrong that sometimes I'll go back and read it and I have no idea what it says. And then I'll spend more time just trying to like figure out what in the world I'm reading that I could have just written it, the old-fashioned way and gotten done faster. So yes and no. I use it some, but not a lot.
It's funny you mentioned that it's not picking up the words. My best friend is originally from Georgia, and when she tries to even talk to like her Alexa, it can't understand her. And we think it's because of her accent, which is kind of interesting. And I don't think her accent's that heavy, but apparently some voice commands do. Jocelyn asked, how did you think of the names for Mystwick and Amelia?
Amelia was originally didn't have that name. What was her original name? I think it was Alice. Her name was originally Alice. And at that time, there were a lot of books coming out in like the same genre with main characters named Alice for some reason. And so my agent said, we should probably change your name because there's a lot of Alice's right now and it could get confusing. And so we were thinking of names and I was like, well, what's your middle name? And her middle name was Amelia. So that's where I got the idea for Amelia. And the name for Mystwick was me thinking, okay, what's a cool name for a magical school that's kind of mysterious, mist something, and just kind of thinking what sounds cool, like Mystwick sounds like a school of magic. So that's where that name came from.
We have another question of how did you choose the colors for the spells?
Okay, good question. So in Mystwick, different kinds of spells, different categories of spells produce different colors when they're being played. So like bio spell, or a spell that like makes plants grow or heals wounds or does something like biological, is called a green spell. So if Amelia is playing her flute and she's playing a green spell, then like green lights come out of her flute and like float around in the air. And so that's a green spell. There's yellow spells, which are for kinetic things like moving things around and stuff like that. White spells, which are like mental magic that affect the mind. Blue spells, which are elemental magic, like for water or fire or earth or something like that. And there are actually other colors of spells that the kids discover in later books as well. And of course, there's black spells, which come into play in book 1, but aren't what they seem. And when you get to the end, you'll see what black spells really are. And that's kind of a big discovery that the kids make. So coming up with the colors, kind of like what makes sense. A green spell makes sense if you're like making plants grow and it's like biological stuff. A white spell just for some reason felt like mental to me for some reason. So it really just kind of based on the feeling, what I feel when I think of that color and how it would be magical.
So we have another question of how did you think of the names of the animals?
The names of the animals. So Musicat, Humfrog, I think are the only 2 that have like a different name than animals in our world. And it was to differentiate between like a normal cat and a musical cat, a musicat, or a frog, but like a magical frog. When it hums, it makes magic. So it's a hum frog. So that when you hear it in the book, you're like, oh, this isn't a normal frog. This frog is like special. Or this cat is special in some way different, because not all the animals in Amelia's world create music. Most of them actually don't. It's just these special ones, a couple special species that can produce magic. So when you hear a different name, you know automatically, okay, this is not a regular cat.
Okay.
Great question.
It looks like Catherine has a hand raised, so go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Are you gonna make another book?
Am I going to do you mean like just another book in general or another Mystwick book?
Another Mystwick book.
So I just finished the 4th Mystwick book yesterday and turned it in to my editor at Audible. I don't know if I will write any more after that. Right now, I don't have plans for more Mystwick books, but it's definitely a world in a series that I could come back to in the future. Right now, I've got a couple other books, new books that I'm working on, a new series that's going to be not like Mystwick, but if you liked Mystwick, I think you would like that series too. I can't say anything about it yet. It's still very, very, very secret. But I also have another series that if you like Mystwick, I think you would like my Skyborn books, which is
Ooh.
about a world where all of the characters are born with wings and they live in different clans according to the type of bird wing they have. So Ellie, one of the main characters, is part of the Sparrow clan because she has sparrow wings. And then Nox, the other main character, is part of the Crow clan. He has crow wings. And there are 3 books in that series. And they're all out, so you can find them. My most recent book that came out is called The Ruby Code. And this story is about Ash, who's a video gamer. And he plays a video game and he meets Ruby, who's a video game character who comes to life and becomes his friend. And there's lots of secrets about her that they discover, and they have a really cool adventure. So if you like video games, then you would really like this book. And then, like I said, my next book, I can't talk about yet, but hopefully I'll get to announce it soon. And if you sign up for my email newsletter on my website, that'll be the first place that I share it, or on my Instagram account if your parents want to check it out there.
Yeah. Is the playlist you mentioned for Mystwick on your website?
You know, I'm not sure if it is.
Okay.
It's called the Mystwick School of Musicraft on Spotify, so you can easily search it there. And you can find it that way. I can't remember if I still have the link up for that.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So Jenna, it sounds like you have a question that Jessica kind of covered of why you picked the flute, but she did ask too, why not a guitar or a small drum? And is it just the flute is like the instrument you really like?
Yeah, and a drum would be a little difficult because like they can't really play like a melody. They're more like for a beat. And a guitar would be really cool though. Would be a
Yeah.
really cool guitar. And one of the main characters does pick up guitar later on in the series, so that comes into play quite a bit as well. But the flute to me was very special to Amelia, and the flute she plays belonged to her mother when she was a little girl, and so it's very sentimental for her. And like I said, I was really inspired by Mozart's opera, The Magic Flute, which is one of the first inspirations for the story.
Yeah. So we are getting a lot of love. Someone saying, if you can, please make more books like this one. Sounds cool. What your other books? So we're going to make this the last question. Forrest asked, why is Mystwick in a forest in a mountain range? I mean, as opposed to any other, place you could have it.
Yeah. Well, first of all, like I said earlier, it was kind of based on this one lodge that my friends and I would go to in the Rocky Mountains in Steamboat Springs, Colorado.
Hmm.
And it is a ski town, but we would go like in the summertime usually. And so the mountains would be beautiful and the leaves on the trees would be gorgeous. And I would go on hikes in the woods and think about Mystwick. And so I got a lot of inspiration there. And also because I live in the mountains and I live in a forest and I always have, and like the forest is my favorite place in the world. In most of my books, most of my stories, there's going to be like forests are going to be a big part of the setting. Not in the Ruby Code because it's set in New York City in the future, but there is a forest in the video game world, so it still comes into play. In the video game world, where the main character like goes to get away from the real world, there's a big forest to explore. So for me, the forest is like the most magical place because when I was growing up, I would be in the woods pretty much from sun up to sundown every single day. And I would be reading, I would write in the woods, I would plan out my stories in the woods. And so for me, like the woods and stories are like always together.
Well, just think if you ever get this made into a movie, you could actually shoot it in Oregon, because I think you would
Ooh.
find up near Multnomah Falls and other places would probably make a really good setting for
Oh my goodness.
Mystwick. Yeah.
Yeah. You have pretty much the most magical forests in North America, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love hiking in Oregon. So you guys are very, very, very lucky.
Yeah. They shoot a lot of movies here too. So that could be really
Hmm.
fun. Well, I know everyone, we probably could ask questions of Jessica all night long, but we are going to let her go. So please, if you want to in the chat, say thank you. I'd love to hear if you're local, come in the next time you're at the bookstore and tell me how much you love the book. I'm going to have to take a copy home with me now and read it. So Jessica, thank you again so much for taking the time, staying up a little bit late with us. And I really do hope everyone continues reading Mystwick. I'm so excited to hear that you have a book 4. That's so much fun to have kids be able to keep going in a series. I know a lot of times that's what they're looking for, is to keep up with those same characters.
For sure. Yeah. I'm so excited. I hope you guys will pick it up.
Yeah. All right, everybody. Don't forget, next week is our rescheduled event for Sam Makes a Splash that we had to reschedule from October. And that will be our last 3rd through 5th. And then we have one for the high school level, which you are all still welcome to join. But we've had such a good time tonight. So thank you again for being here. Keep reading and keep shopping at your local independent bookstore, because they really love having you there. All right. I'm going to hit that.